Okay, I just finished this book, Leviathan and its enemies, and we should definitely talk about it. And I'm going to put Leviathan down over here because he's heavy. I mean, after all, as you can see, this book is about 730 pages, and it's really dense with information. The book basically has some of the most novel ideas I've never seen anywhere else. Typically, when we think of left-right dichotomy, we tend to just think of the left versus the right. If I had to sum it up in one sentence, the left really just wants as big of government as possible, and they want the government to intervene as much as they can, because the government can always fix stuff. And then the right wants to be left alone, with as little government intervention as possible, and if anything, have the smallest government, similar to the night watchman and referee sort of government. Now, obviously, what we have today is this gigantic government, which was never intended by our founding fathers. But this book has amazing perspectives and looks at politics in a completely new and different light. And honestly, I've never heard any of these ideas anywhere except in this book. It really doesn't have that much to do with the left and the right, as much as it does the psychology of whatever the source of power has been, especially after World War II. Hence why, since 1945, we've had a very, very specialized managerial type of economy and state with many corporations, whereas before the 1920s or so, it wasn't the case. One of the most important relationships that this book looks at is the relationship between mass corporations and small entrepreneurial firms. When it comes to the mass corporations, they want to drive out any competition they can, and the first competitors they try to drive into the ground are the entrepreneurial firms. The entrepreneurial firms tend to represent conservative values, and the giant corporations tend to represent more liberal values. But here's the crazy thing. He argues that mass corporations use mass advertising to kind of pool everyone's wants and needs into this smaller circle, and they try to control that so that whatever they produce, everyone will want on a massive scale. Consequently, the conservative entrepreneurial firms value frugality, thrift, prudence, continence, sacrifice, and the most important part, the postponement or denial of gratification. When we look at the biggest differences between the left and the right, the deferral of gratification is generally one of the huge indicators of whether someone will line up on the left or right. It's not always the case, but it usually is, right? Also, with mass advertising, the book basically says that these corporations can control large populations very easily by appealing to very hedonistic lifestyle. You know, pleasure, sexuality, gorging, stuff like this. So because mass advertising is so powerful, he basically argues with the power of mass advertising, they are trying to homogenize everyone's taste and the culture more or less. Try to get whatever you can now, sex now, food now, eat now, drugs now, whatever, right? No deferral of gratification and homogenization. Try to make everyone and everything the same in the culture, right? Make sure that individuality is dead. And everyone just eats off the hand that feeds them, which would be the mass corporations in that case, right? And now it's time to show off my amazing shoulders. So something that was taught probably in 7th grade for maybe all of 5 minutes was that we have 3 parts of government: executive, judicial, and legislative. However, in this book, he basically says that the mass bureaucratization of the government is almost always found in the executive. Now, I don't have a great understanding of the 3 branches of power, to be honest, so this is just completely new to me. I'm just kind of accepting that at face value. Moving on, the managerial state sees all the problems of modern society as something to be solved. It can be crime, war, ignorance, poverty, slums, disease, whatever. As long as you have an expert working on it, it can be solved. And furthermore, they might actually see conservatives as a problem that needs to be solved. He also argues that the most important part of the managerial state, which more or less dominates all society, is the university and other educational institutions. It gives people very specific and technical skills. So more or less, the fusion of the state, economy, and education is in fact a fusion of the state, economy, and culture, and all 3 reflect interest imperatives of mass organizations and the managerial elite. And the book goes off in the time period after World War II as being one of the most important times to generate all these institutions in managerial ways that weren't seen before World War II. And it plays out perfectly, right? Because when we look at universities today versus 80 years ago, universities were guaranteed jobs in the 20s and were extremely rigorous. Even the 60s, 70s, and 80s, degrees were very powerful. The 90s and 2000s, okay, but now in 2010s and especially the 2020s, everyone has a degree and it's very oversaturated, especially since the bar's been lowered so much. I'll tell you what, the university that I went to probably had a way more rigorous curriculum 50 years ago than it did when I went. When I went, it just felt like a giant cash grab, to be honest. While he does talk about certain presidencies in the past, as someone who was born in 1997, I basically have very little conception of the Clinton administration, Bush, Reagan, and going back. So when the book talks about looking at perspectives, right, where you look at FDR and the New Deal, and how that was basically one of the beginnings of the whole managerial state as a whole, given that the New Deal expanded huge amounts of government infrastructure, the meat and potatoes of people who ran between around 1935 to about 1980 when Reagan won, was that people would sometimes run sort of backhandedly or maybe more directly on restricting the New Deal or trying to take it away. The book makes an excellent point that all that rhetoric died as soon as Reagan won the administration, and even though Reagan was seen as a Republican, he really didn't do a whole lot to actually reduce the bureaucratization of the government. And since Ronald Reagan's administration, nobody's really talked about at a serious level deconstructing the New Deal and any of the infrastructure that it added. Now, as someone who was born in 1997, that's mind-blowing to me because the New Deal and all that stuff is just common knowledge at this point, but the fact that people might have run against that at some point and tried to deconstruct it in the 60s and 70s and even 50s is mind-blowing. The next big idea kind of in the book is around chapter 3, where it talks about Vilfredo Pareto. Pareto is most well known from the Pareto principle of the 80-20 rule. If a company has a given amount of 100 sales or whatever the unit is, 80% of that will come from about 20% of the employees. It's an unequal distribution. Now, what Pareto is not known for is the stuff that's mentioned in this book. Pareto talks a lot about two types of people, especially in these giant organizations like big government or corporation. When we look at the Nazis in Soviet Union, they were based on, coercion. You're gonna do what I want, I don't give a shit, fuck you. You're gonna comply and like it. It's different when we look at class 1 type people. Class 1 type people are represented in America with their large institutions and mass organizations. They rely on mass manipulation rather than coercion. They're very bad at fighting direct wars, and they'll go fight proxy stuff. In turn, rather than use military force and might is right, they use mass manipulation and homogenization, trying to scope everyone into a box and reduce the amount of individuality. And the mass media is a huge part of that. Common instruments of the Soviet Union and Nazis were secret police, informers, state censors, inquisitors, and mass communication. And the ideologies that serve the interests of the elite therefore tend to be rather vague and to cover up their evasion of philosophical and scientific problems with rhetoric, and therefore most elites simply do not confine themselves to beliefs that are too rigorous. Something that the book does really well towards the middle of it is it goes in depth about the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. It discusses the stipulations of the New Deal and how the government massively expanded its power. We went from a small type government of the 19th century to a very large one in the 1930s and 40s, and hence why we have the government we have today post-World War II, with massive bureaucracies, all trying to expand their power. Now, once again, as someone that was born in 1997, my conception of the Truman, Eisenhower, and JFK/Lyndon B. Johnson administrations are pretty terrible. But with that said, this book actually goes into a deep dive, especially in the Eisenhower administration, and I appreciate this so much because other than knowing that he was a general and he did a giant highway act, I really didn't know much about his administration, and I feel like I learned quite a bit about it, or at least a general understanding from it. It's not the longest excerpt on those, but I appreciate it nonetheless. I want to read this quote about the Constitution and how little it was attacked before the Civil War and slightly after, whereas in the 1900s, all of a sudden the Supreme Court was making decisions left, right, and center. The resistance of the executive to legislative power was paralleled by the increase in Supreme Court decisions striking down congressional actions as unconstitutional. Between 1900 and 1940, the court delivered 49 opinions declaring congressional legislation unconstitutional, in contrast to only 2 such decisions prior to the Civil War and about 20 between 1865 and 1900. Since the 1940s, the rejection of congressional as well as state and local legislation as unconstitutional has become commonplace. Another idea that the book quickly calls out is the idea of managerial globalism. We already have enough managerial problems as it is in just the United States of America, but it sees right through the playbook of trying to make everyone into one homogeneous world. And the writer was obviously a very smart person, especially living in the pre-internet era, more or less. He also actually talks a great deal about Joseph McCarthy in the 50s ordeal with the Red Scare and what interests he generally represented and to whom he was a detriment. Now it starts talking about the Nixon and Reagan era as well, and it actually goes off on Reagan a little bit, basically saying that even though Reagan was kind of like a Republican, he just didn't attack the bureaucracy enough. Kind of like Trump said he was going to drain the swamp, but it didn't really work out that way, right? Now, typically in a history book, you typically think that when a book covers administrations, that it's going to be extra dry and boring. But what you have to remember with this book is it's taking it into account from the lens of its original argument that everything's a mass organization, and it's viewed through those lenses, and therefore, it's far from boring because it's a novel idea and it explores that in each administration. So it might sound kind of boring on paper, but it's a fascinating journey and expands viewpoints and horizons I didn't think I would even see. Mainly because we're just so used to our left-right dichotomy, and we're kind of all in this box of, okay, if it's this idea, it's only in this box, but sometimes you can think outside the box, and that's kind of what this whole book is, an argument about thinking outside the box about managerial organization. One of the last major points the book covers towards the end is the growth of neoconservatism, and how conservatives have just genuinely accepted giant bureaucracies and mass organizations and government. While it doesn't necessarily truly go off of neoconservatism, it just terms it really well, and it goes over the beginnings of it, especially post-Reagan era. I've tried my best to sum up the big ideas of the book, but honestly, I am scratching the absolute smallest bit of the tip of the iceberg compared to the rest of the book. I basically spent like 9 or 10 minutes talking about the book as a whole, but these are like the biggest possible ideas. It goes into so much more depth and it's really worth it. Now, with that being said, there are some criticisms I want to emphasize with this book. We need to remember that this book was released posthumously. I guess he left this book on his hard drive and someone found it after he had died, but this book was written in the 90s and it was never really finished. So because it's not the most edited work, there are tons of repetitive sections, but hey, if you see something 16 times, you're gonna get the main idea. Aside from its repetitiveness, it also loves to use lots of vocabulary words I'm not familiar with, so you better keep dictionary.com handy next to you while you read this. The amount of times that I had to look words up in this book was obnoxious. And that really adds to how digestible the book isn't. It's written like an academic essay more than a novel. And because of that, it is so dense and full of information, and it's very hard to just kind of pick up and read casually. When you're reading it, you have to really intensely be looking at all the ideas he conveys and try to come to your own conclusions with some of those. There were a few times where I felt myself wandering off while I was reading it, and because I missed a sentence or two, I missed a big idea and I had to go back and try to reread it, because further on there seemed like there was an idea that I missed when I was reading it. So for the average normie, this book is not going to be read. If you're working 40 hours a week, you come home from, say, the office, you've had to deal with all that corporate bullshit and all the morons in that facility, and then you want to come home and read this is not easy to digest whatsoever. It's very much worth it, but I just think that it would be very intense for a lot of people, especially given that, you know, the size of this thing is huge. I mean, if I threw this thing hard enough at someone in the face, they would definitely end up in the hospital. And just remember, it's this thick and it's written like an academic essay, so the digestibility, not very good. So overall, I give the book a 10. I give the digestibility probably a 2 or 3. It's not like reading a foreign language, but the sentence structure is definitely complex and very large. I would give accessibility to readers probably pretty difficult, so maybe like a 3 or 4. If you have a really intense job where you're thinking the whole day, kind of like a lawyer or whatever, in that manner, the book is very prohibitive, because when you're reading it, you have to really sit there and focus on it. You can't just BS your way through this book, at least if you want to get the main benefits from it. Anyway, those are like the biggest main ideas of the book. I highly recommend you read this book. And maybe if your schedule's too tight right now, you can put it off to the side for another time when you can really hone in and focus on this. Again, the effort is worth the reward with this book.